Welcome to Recurring Insight. It's the beginning of your upkeep, so it's time for another episode. I'm your host, Michael, and let's dive in. Today we'll be taking a look at the Stax pieces that see play in cEDH. Before we get into it, it's important to look at the methodology of the video. I went through every list on the cEDH decklist database, which is linked in the description, and sorted each piece by color. From there, I determined what percentage of decks that could run it, do run it. This percentage, unfortunately, does not account for how niche a card is. This means that although it can serve as an indicator of the power level of a card, cards with a low percentage of inclusion should not necessarily be discarded. It's also important to note that Stax pieces can definitely be a meta call, so even if a piece wouldn't normally fit into a deck, if that's what your pod calls for, you shouldn't exclude it just because the piece normally sees play in different decks. Now that that's out of the way, let's get into part 1. To start, we have the pieces that attack Tutors. Opposition Agent is the strongest card in this section by a long shot. It turns Tutors for your opponents into Tutors for you, all for the low price of 2 generic and a black. Ultimately, it's good enough that even non-Stax decks need a reason to cut it. The biggest one that pops up is Speed. Although the effect is more than powerful enough to justify the 3 CMC, the card doesn't do anything unless an opponent tutors. Some proactive decks are too focused on their own plan, typically ad nauseum, to include it. Aven Mind Sensor is a significant step down from the Agent. Your opponents still get a chance to tutor, but it does cut off access to the overwhelming majority of the deck. It sees the most play in lower colored decks that need the balance for their own lack of tutors, but it sees play in higher colored decks as well. Stax decks that run it typically have some sort of synergy with creatures, while non-Stax decks that run it are typically non-black, since they have more to make up for in the tutor department. Ashiok, Dream Render, hits not only searching the library, but the graveyard as well. Despite hitting both, it's held back by being a Planeswalker. Planeswalkers have synergies that don't mesh with most cEDH decks, and they're vulnerable to combat. There are some decks that it synergizes with, like Sisay and Muldrotha. Sisay can tutor for it, and Muldrotha can recur it. Without having a synergy with it, in order to run it and get value from it, you need to be committed enough to having creatures on the board that you can protect it from 3 players that all want to murk it. Leonin Arbiter is a tax for tutors. 2 mana, although it hurts, is doable, so it's limited to low color Stax decks that don't have too many better options or are already running those better options. It is worth noting that it gets better against higher color decks, which have more tutor options and are more reliant on fetches. Last and least is Stranglehold. It sees very little play as a result of its high CMC. It makes it into low color decks that rely on generating an advantage in hand, either through draw like Riel, or discard like Kroxa. Each section is sorted by the highest inclusion percentage in the category, so although the casting spells section is one of the smallest, it's up here solely due to Drannith Magistrate. Unless you're casting a spell from your hand, you're not casting it. Although Reanimation does dodge this, Commanders don't, and it's for that reason that Drannith Magistrate is so powerful and hated. Since most decks want to cast their commander, it has almost universal effectiveness. Typically, if you can run it, you need a reason to cut it. The main reason that it's cut is speed. Not many proactive decks run it, since it doesn't actively advance their game plan. I was actually pretty surprised that Counterbalance saw so much play. It lets you invest in a counterspell before it's needed, and it's a recurring effect, making it a nice hybrid between a Stax piece and stack interaction. Unless you have top deck synergy though, it's hit and miss as to whether or not you can actually counter the spell. Since cEDH has such a low curve, you do have a pretty good chance of hitting the right CMC, so it's included in decks without top deck synergies, although they do need to be fairly committed to Stax. Altogether, it's a good card but not exceptional, only seeing play in Mono Blue, Azorius, and decks with top deck synergies. This Teferi is extremely powerful. In fact, it's too powerful. It makes you the sole person able to cast spells at instant speed, which means stopping win attempts is your responsibility. Policing 3 other people isn't an ideal situation, even though they can't really defend themselves. You're going to run out of interaction sooner or later. Unless you're in some type of Curious Control type deck where control is your main plan and you have the draw to sustain it, it will backfire hard unless you treat it as protection for a win attempt. That's why it's included in Sisay. It's legendary and therefore can be tutored to the battlefield on an opponent's end step if needed. I wasn't very impressed when I first saw Void Mirror, and my opinion hasn't changed. It only truly hits free spells, since you can still pay colored mana for colorless spells, so although it does hit some good targets, it's inconsistent. It's currently only included in Gruul decks that don't have access to the white pieces. There isn't much to say about Void Winnower. It's extremely strong but has a prohibitively high CMC. Unless you can picture running it in your deck, don't run it. It only makes it into Kinnan because Kinnan can generate an insane amount of mana. Finally, we have Mana Maze. This is a weird card that punishes relying too heavily on one color. It's more effective against lower color decks, but even higher color decks tend to favor certain colors more than others. It's difficult to properly break parity on it, although it is most easily abused by artifacts, which dodge it entirely and essentially reset it. It makes it into Emery, but that's it. These can be game-changing cards. Artifact Hate is in a great position right now due to so many popular combos relying on artifacts. By far the most popular piece is Collector Oof. It's a null rot effect on a body, which means you get creature synergies and it avoids non-creature tax effects, which isn't something all decks need to consider, but for Stax decks, it is a nice bonus. It's good enough that if you're in green, unless it's a non-bow with your game plan or a primary win condition, you should run it. Funnily enough, it is cut from some lower color green decks that in the absence of other options, turn to artifacts for ramp. Null Rod is the OG Null Rod effect. Unfortunately, it is no longer the best at its job. It is still very good though, and the generic casting cost lends itself to higher colored decks. Although if they're running Null Rod, they can probably afford to run Oof. This leads to a situation where Null Rod serves as redundancy for Oof. Stony Silence is in the same position, except it's the easiest to counter. It is more difficult to remove than Null Rod or Oof, but it's still the worst of the three. This is a pretty big step down in terms of power level, but it does serve as removal. It stops artifact-based combos and is an alright tempo play, although it most likely come down after the majority of ramp has been played. It's one-sided, so you can run it even if you rely on artifacts. It's restricted to non-white decks with 2 or less colors, since white has more options. Aura of Silence doesn't stop Dockside combos, but having to pay 2 more is normally worse than having something enter tapped, which makes it a better tempo play than Manglehorn. Additionally, you crack it to remove something, which gives you more control, but you don't get to keep it after you remove something. Unfortunately, it, like many of the other effects in this section, plays second fiddle to Oof. That being said, if you don't have access to green, this is one-sided. Next up is Blind Obedience. The low inclusion percentage is mostly due to it being white, which means that decks that could run it have a plethora of other Stax options to run instead. In order for this to make the cut, you need some kind of additional synergy, like Sithis or Brawlin and Shabraz. War of the Spark Karn is actually one of my favorite planeswalkers, and serves as a one-sided Oof effect. His +1 pops Cheerios, but his -2 can pretty much be ignored. He does cost 4 generic, which is a pretty penny and excludes him from most fast decks. He rarely makes it outside of 1 and 2 color decks. In higher color lists, if you want to hit artifacts, you have better options. If those better options interfere with your game plan, then the card quality is high enough that you should probably play something else. There are of course exceptions, but between the CMC and him being vulnerable to creatures, his inclusion should be on a case-by-case basis. Kataki, War's Wage, has one large drawback, which is that it uses an upkeep trigger. It's a good upkeep trigger that forces opponents to use artifacts in order to keep those artifacts, but it's still an upkeep trigger. Although it will hit developmental artifacts, it doesn't stop artifact combos, and with the number of options that do hit combos, it's just outshined. Unless you're extremely focused on artifacts, or are alright with letting your artifacts die, this shouldn't make the cut. This last card comes with a lot of drawbacks. It does turn off artifacts, but it does so by turning them into creatures. This hits Cheerios, but does give your opponents free beats. It also costs as much as Karn, but isn't one-sided. Between the drawbacks and the plethora of other options, it only makes it into Sithis for its enchantment synergies. This category of pieces attacks card draw. Draw is an integral part of Magic. It's hard to play cards if you don't have any cards in hand to play. Notion Thief is the most iconic piece, which turns card draw for your opponents into card draw for yourself. The 4 CMC excludes it from extremely proactive decks, but it's also not run in many Stax decks. Stax decks are, by their very nature, slower, and wheels benefit faster decks most. Since Stax decks don't have the same incentive to wheel as other decks, they're less able to abuse it. Unless you fall into one of those 2 categories, you should consider running this. Narset is mono blue, which means it sees play in the same kind of decks as Notion Thief, but is more accessible. The casting cost is restrictive, but double blue is a pretty standard requirement in blue decks. It's mostly seen in 3 or less color decks that look to generate an advantage in the hand, like Riel, or decks that look to abuse it. It works best in decks with red, but it's not required. Chains is brutal. You can draw as long as you discard a card, which means that you're not drawing. It's symmetrical, so there are 2 ways to gain advantage from it. You need to either be focused on attacking your opponent's hands, or you need to have an engine that draws cards without actually drawing cards, like Yuriko. If you fall into either of those categories, you're going to have a hard time finding a more potent piece for the cost. Here we have the White Thief, which is a step down from the original. Although the same mana cost, Alms Collector draws at most 1 card for each trigger, and only hits effects that cause multiple cards to be drawn at a time. This cuts out a lot of Stax utility, and is currently only seen in Aminatou. Spirit of the Labyrinth comes at the low price of just 1 and a white. This hate bear has a weird trend. It sees play in mono white, Abzan, and Naya decks. Winota also runs it, but that's in part because it's a non-human creature. The common thread is the lack of blue and the inclusion of white and green. Blue has the best card draw, while white and green tend to struggle in that area, so that tracks. This is another one that you have to picture in your deck before running it. If you can live with only drawing 1 card a turn, go for it. Finally, we have Zur's Weirding. Currently, this only sees play in Muldrotha, since it can cast what was milled. I could also see this in decks that have draw engines that don't actually draw, but its high CMC is another limiting factor. Land hate is in kind of a weird position right now. Artifacts are an absolute powerhouse, and come down before most of these effects, which greatly limit their usefulness. Even outside of artifacts, most cEDH decks invest heavily into non-land ramp because it's generally faster than land ramp. However, there isn't a single deck that doesn't want to play at least a couple of lands, so this section is universally effective, although it may be overshadowed for more pointed pieces. Yasharn has the highest inclusion percentage, although that is primarily due to being 2 colors. Although this doesn't directly attack lands, the paying life clause hits fetches. This means that it's restricted to 2 and 3 color decks, since 4 and 5 color decks really like fetches. Honestly, that's the main thing to look for. If you can live without fetches, it's a good piece to consider, considering it does find your next 2 land drops. Up next is one of the few pieces cheap enough to play consistently in the early game. It hits lands and artifacts, which is a huge plus. Between the 2 effects, it slows the game down to a pace that's comfortable for Stax decks. Even grindy, non-Stax decks run it. They do need to be a lower color deck, since it's doubly effective against fetches, but even Metapod runs it, so it does make it into the higher color pairings. Since it's generally useful and hits artifact heavy decks hard, unless your win con requires things to enter untapped, like Atla, this should be among the first wave of contenders for Stax decks. Back to Basics hoses a lot of my decks and leaves a couple untouched. If your deck is one of the ones that are relatively untouched by it, you should consider running it. Typically, that means mono blue and sans black and white decks. Black decks need non-basics to accommodate Tainted Pact, while white decks typically splash white, which causes a greater need for non-basics. Blood Moon isn't as effective of a Stax piece as Back to Basics, so it's playable by a wider variety of decks, but if you're in blue, you're most likely playing Back to Basics instead. It does turn off fetches, so it doesn't see play above 3 colors. This is another piece that doesn't need to go in a Stax deck. As long as you're a slower deck that can play it and operate relatively unaffected, you should consider it, because a lot of other decks are going to hurt from it. If you wish Blood Moon had a body, look no further. This is included in the same kind of decks as Blood Moon, for redundancy, but also makes it into decks that have creature synergies. Hokori is only seen in Derevi because Derevi can produce insane amounts of mana. If you can abuse Hokori, you can play it, but so few decks do it effectively enough to warrant the inclusion of a relatively expensive piece. The bad Thalia is significantly worse than the good Thalia. It does serve as a temple play, but only hitting non-basic lands and creatures is not a very good effect for 3 mana. This normally shouldn't be in the running unless you are running very low on options. Storm Cauldron is extremely expensive, but it does offer a powerful effect. Unfortunately, this can backfire and give other players the extra mana they need to combo off if they're short on lands, which is most cEDH decks. This only makes it into Chulane since it's a combo piece. Overburden is significantly cheaper, but also narrower than Storm Cauldron. Most decks do want to cast creatures, even if it's just their commander, but it is going to hit green decks much harder than others. Currently, it only makes it into Tulane since it's a combo piece, but these two cards could make it into decks that abuse land triggers as well. Despite having the most pieces, Creature Hate isn't seen as often as some of the other categories. At the top of the list though is Oko. His inclusion percent is carried by his Simic color identity, but he's still an effective piece. Every turn, you get to turn a creature or artifact of your opponent's into a 3/3 elk without abilities. The two requirements to run him are having a slower or mid-range deck and having a commander with at least 3 toughness to protect him. Linvala is Creature Hate for the creature-based deck. It's a one-sided cursed totem on a body, and between the two characteristics, it sees play consistently throughout the color pie, although it heavily favors green decks due to dorks. Although more Stax decks run it than other decks, it does make it into other archetypes. The main concerns are having a strong creature synergy, and actually using the one-sided aspect of it. If you don't have creature synergies, you should only consider running this in 1 and 2 color Stax decks. Up next is the Grand Cenobite herself. She's at the top of the curve for Stax pieces, so despite being a passive board wipe that also buffs your own creatures, she only sees sporadic play. She's mostly played in green decks and only makes it into one Sans green deck, and that's a Tymna Kraum list that focuses on hate bears. Although she does serve as a lock with Living Plane, which turns lands into 1/1 creatures, that's not why she typically sees play. If you can reliably get to 7 mana and you're green Stax decks with creature synergies, this should be considered since it does fulfill a couple of different roles. Cursed Totem is by far the most iconic piece in this section. It turns off activated abilities of creatures for a mere 2 generic mana, and as someone with a Thrasios deck, this can do a lot of work. It's symmetrical, so it's mostly run in Sans green decks, since they don't have to worry about hosing their own dorks. If you're playing a Stax deck or even just a slower deck, unless it's a non-bow with a large portion of your deck, or win con, you should give Cursed Totem a chance. I had a bit of an internal debate of whether or not to even put Villas in this video. He's primarily a source of card draw, but by activating him you also get to interact with the board. Ultimately, he earned a cautious inclusion, but you should only run him if you're going to be cheating him out, typically via reanimation. Goblin Bombardment is another one that I was unsure about including. It's close enough that it makes the cut. However, it should only make the cut for your deck if it's a combo piece or a finisher. Although it can convert creatures into damage, it's hard to view it well enough for it to be worth it outside of it also serving as a win con. Goblin Sharpshooter is more of a Stax piece than the previous two. Although he does combo with Splinter Twin, he also keeps the board clear of creatures with 1 toughness. If you untap with him, your opponents can kiss their dorks goodbye. He's good enough that he doesn't need to be part of a combo to make it in, but he's pretty much restricted to decks comboing with him and green decks that want one-sided board control. Although I don't play any decks that run Tabernacle, it's one of my favorite pieces. You can't counter it, you just have to remove it before your upkeep, which isn't easy. Although dorks can pay for themselves, it still takes them offline. It does come with a few drawbacks. Playing it uses up your land drop for the turn, and it taxes you as well. To play this, you need to be a Staxy deck that has synergy with it like Daryl, or have very few creatures like Urza, who's on Polymorph. Pestilence is pretty straightforward. You turn mana into damage for both creatures and players. The sticking point here is the mana cost. It's too expensive to run unless you can abuse it like Karik does. If you want to rankle your opponents, look no further. You can hit their hands and their boards, which makes it a good fit for Nath. However, unless you can spare the creature yourself, it's not worth running. Ulvenwald Tracker, despite serving as repeatable removal, does need another creature to function, and needs to be at least a decent sized creature. Between Summoning Sickness and relying on having a larger creature, it only makes it into Yisan since it can be tutored for. Containment Priest is niche, but it's a relevant niche. It hits reanimation, polymorph effects, and tutors to the field. Unfortunately, despite cheating creatures out being prevalent in cEDH, it's still niche, and serves as a filler piece for low-color Stax decks. Pestilence Demon is in the same spot as Pestilence, but worse. You need to be able to cheat it out, and considering the other options that can be cheated out, I can't see it making it out of Karik. This Cephalid is rather interesting. It does hit specifically blue creatures, which misses most creatures, but considering the amount of commanders with blue, you'll more than likely keep at least one commander off the table. It's most effective against mid-range decks, so it's more of a meta call than most pieces. Creature synergy is certainly recommended because you really don't want to pay 4 mana just to hit blue creatures. In fact, it only sees play in Shu Lane, which turns creatures into draw and a free land drop. This section is almost exclusively played in Sand's blue decks. Stopping activated abilities from being activated requires either countering the permanent on the stack or removing it, which gives its controller a chance to activate it still. You could run stifle effects, but you shouldn't. Without access to counters, some decks turn to targeting the activated abilities of a single permanent. Flamescroll's Celebrant sees the most play despite only pinging non-mana activated abilities. The reason for this can be seen by flipping the card over. It doubles as a silence effect. It only sees play in a few higher colored decks that want an additional silence effect. It synergizes well with Recursion to Hand, but it does see play in Reanimation decks as well. The only other deck it sees play in is an Isai Jeska deck, and Flamescroll's Celebrant hits harder when staring down the barrel of a buffed up Isai. The Celebrant wasn't quite what I was picturing for this section when I was organizing the pieces, but Phyrexian Revoker definitely fits here. It hits non-land abilities and comes with artifact and creature synergies. Pithing Needle is in a similar position, but it also hits lands. For the cost of 1 less mana, you lose out on the body and the creature synergies, leaving you to rely on artifacts. Immovable Rod is a good deal more versatile since you can change the targeted permanent after it hits the field, but it does cost mana to activate. It only makes it into Oswald since it's fetchable. Finally, there is Sorceress Spyglass. This does miss mana abilities, but if you're willing to pay an extra mana for Pithing Needle to look at someone's hand, this is the card for you. I'm guessing you're probably not willing, since this only makes it into Oswald. Honestly, unless you're running these because your deck's color identity doesn't allow access to other pieces, these are more of a meta call than most of the other pieces in this video. And there we go, that wraps up part 1. Credit goes to Scryfall for the images and the authors of the decks on the database for the lists. As you may have noticed, Recurring Insight got a new logo and, assuming I followed through on posting the combo guide last week, is back to the weekly posting schedule. Check me out on Twitter for any announcements. I'm also planning on running polls there to determine the topics of videos in the future, so if you'd like a say in that, the link will be in the description. Thank you all for taking the time to watch, I really appreciate it and I hope it's been helpful. If you liked the video or think it's been beneficial, please hit the like and subscribe buttons so you don't miss a video. I'm your host Michael, and I'll see you next week for another episode of Recurring Insight.